Hi, Tiera.
Hi, Emma. How are you?
I'm all right, thanks. How are you?
Good.
Good. So we're here today on Super Shiro with Tiera Rainey, a community advocate based here in Tucson, Arizona. Tiera, how did you get involved in the kind of work that you're doing?
It's actually pretty funny because most people kind of assume I've always done this work. But in fact, 3 years ago, I guess almost four now, I was a government contractor in Washington, D.C. So if you want to talk about a serious career shift, by the time I was 30, I am living proof that you can, I think, completely dismantle and reinvent yourself, but in the service of others. So I'm actually from Tucson, which surprises a lot of people. They're like, oh, there are Black people in Tucson. I'm like, yes, there are. Long-standing community. In fact, I'm a second generation Tucsonan, so I feel like I wear that badge very proudly. And so I had gone to graduate school on the East Coast and was pursuing this career in international affairs. And, I had this very big epiphany that it was just not work that I felt like was actually in line with my values, especially in terms of impact and helping people. I think I started off in a very macro view, this idea of diplomacy and this idea of, oh, the way to affect change is like to change the world. And I recognized I did some work in Afghanistan for a short period of time. And on these travels and working in these various industries, I think I began to get an assessment where I recognized that real change happened on a community level. And I felt a very deep, I guess I felt deeply compelled to return home. And I dismantled my life in DC and moved back to Arizona. And it started off with honestly just organically doing things in my free time, volunteering, helping my family establish the Tucson Second Chance Community Bail Fund, that is seeking to decriminalize poverty here in Pima County. And I've been fortunate enough to also land, a couple different positions in the nonprofit sector where I've been able to get paid, which is, again, I'm a unicorn in many ways. I get paid to do advocacy around the community, but always it's really a mixture of things. I spend the vast majority of my time nowadays doing advocacy around the carceral state and about getting people out of cages. I'm an abolitionist, so that's a really big piece of, I think, my evolution. And again, that stuff doesn't happen overnight. But that, I think, deeply informs all of my community work and advocacy, because abolition isn't just really about the prison system. To me, it's about liberation, and liberation is thriving communities, it's resource communities. So really, it's just like it's very interesting to see all the different ways, all these different projects actually relate to that core value of just wanting people to be free to thrive.
Yeah. How do you see all of that kind of working now with everything going on in the world with COVID-19? Like, how does that change or come into play or bring these things together? What's your reaction to that?
Well, I can imagine that for most folks, this is still incredibly surreal. Um, not even my parents have lived through something like this, or my grandparents. This is unprecedented, and I can see how for many people this would be a very overwhelming experience. And I think because I do community advocacy, really, I live it. My natural instinct was to spring to action. And I'm sure that a lot of people are wondering, how can I help in a moment when there's such great need and very complicated issues are at play as well, right?
Right.
And so I always suggest to people to start small. So for me, it wasn't necessarily that I was instantly like, let me plug into an organization. What it started with was actually just asking people what they needed, knowing that, for example, there's a lot of people that are immunocompromised. And in fact, one of them, that there are elderly folks that are more at risk that really cannot be going to the stores, or knowing that there were folks in community that could not get the things they needed because the stores had been, you know, the shelves were empty. They couldn't get toilet paper. They couldn't get their basic essentials, and they couldn't keep up with the crowds. They couldn't get up early, and they needed assistance. And it just started off with word of mouth, honestly, of just going to the store, trying to find, you know, different pieces of the different things that I knew that really vulnerable folks needed, and knowing that it's not just me, that there's hundreds of me, thousands of me doing all these like little acts of kindness that I think, and not just kindness, but just really acts of survival and compassion. That's, I think, a really beautiful thing. And now, because this is becoming obviously more of a mid to long-term reality, I think you're seeing kind of a formalization of networks and people trying to kind of get a little more order into it. And it's easier to plug into organizations and different people that have widespread efforts, including the food banks, including some of the shelters. But I think the really amazing thing about this moment is, while it is scary and there are a lot of unknowns, that there are really actually a number of ways that you can just jump in, and you don't necessarily have to wait on someone to give you permission to do it.
Right. So, oh my gosh, I have so many questions for you.
Sorry, I know I have very long.
No, I'm just, and everything you say makes me want to ask three more things. I want to ask a really difficult question, and I think it's one that everybody's wrestling with. So from your perspective, and I think having had a hand in so many different areas of community life and advocacy, how in a time like this, when the need is so great, when in a community like Tucson, you know, where there's already so much poverty, and now there are all these other layers, how do we prioritize? How do we meet every need? Like, what are the steps, and how do we do this?
I think the first thing is being incredibly intentional with anything that you're designing. I think it has to be key in, and really also understanding the history and context of the place that we're in. Of course, I think Tucson is known as a relatively liberal community, or a progressive community for Arizona anyways. However, it doesn't change the history of segregation in this country, and specifically in this town. For example, we have Dunbar Pavilion, which used to be the segregated elementary school, right? So that red lining is still very much, I think, entrenched in the way that resources are still distributed in Tucson. And so it is incredibly important, I think, for any sort of aid efforts that are happening, that it also be centered around some of the most vulnerable people. And often that means maybe not directly, I mean, obviously the challenge is right now we can't physically hold space with one another, but reaching out to the different organizations that are doing work in those vulnerable communities, because they know the people that need the things. And I think that making sure that those people are not left out. You know, social media is amazing. I love it. I use it as a tool all the time to connect to people, but I also recognize that there's limits and whole groups of people that are participating in those conversations because maybe they don't even have money for internet, that, you know, that based on just age and race demographics, they're not going to be on certain platforms. And so I think when you're designing things, recognizing who's participating in the conversation, it doesn't mean that folks of privilege can't be a part of these spaces, but I think it's about making sure that if I'm a person of privilege, I'm not claiming a bunch of groceries I don't necessarily need right now, right? Making sure that you're stepping back and creating space to allow, I think, those that maybe don't necessarily have the same connections, but don't necessarily have access to transportation. All of these things, like there's no simple answer or simple fix to it, because as you said, there's multiple layers. It's not just vulnerable means a lot of things right now. It's poverty. It's whether you're documented versus undocumented. There's a lot of different things that are happening right now. And I think that these are just constant conversations that we all have to have as a community, especially when we're talking about distributing resources. But also really, like I said, I think the number one concern is just making sure that folks that live in food deserts, folks that live in areas that have less public transportation, making sure that they're not even more isolated by the measures we're all taking to kind of have social distancing.
Yeah. So one of the things that you're doing during this time is you're part of the Tucson Mutual Aid Facebook group.
Yes.
So can you talk a little bit? I saw some posts about, kind of watching you go from a member of the group to a moderator. Are you able to talk at all about why you kind of, stepped up in that space?
I think it's just my innate nature to be bossy. But also just because exactly, like it was not some deep design I had in any way, shape, or form. I think essentially I was already, many people are doing mutual aid, and I want to also lift up that I did not create that effort. Like, the people that are actually doing the work to formalize that are amazing group of brown women who stepped up and created that form, that are, organizing whole volunteer networks and created that page. And so it was in no way meant to degrade their work in any way, shape, or form. But I had seen that, I recognized what a powerful tool that Facebook had been, in terms of just, people looking for resources, but that because it had just kind of been created in this moment, that there hadn't been, I think, the space for folks to create kind of the parameters to make sure that it was useful as it could be. So it was getting a little overrun with like memes and, again, feel good things are great, but I think that particular space to me was about uplifting vulnerable people and making sure that people were getting what they needed. And mutual aid is actually a very radical principle, even though it doesn't sound radical, right? But the idea is that we are providing what we need for each other, right? That we're not waiting on other things, or not necessarily government assistance. Of course, all those things are helpful. But the idea is that it's not about money. It's not about promoting businesses. It should be about, hey, I'm hungry. Can someone please help me? Hey, I have a bunch of seeds. Can I give that to you to make sure that your family's fed, and we can exchange things and barter? So it's actually a really beautiful concept. And so it was more just, I made a comment about wanting to just like, I was like, so what's happening here? What are the rules? And I think, in fact, they responded. They were amazing because they heard the feedback. It wasn't anything personal, and they recognized that there is value in creating more parameters. And I think there had always been the intention to create that, but just because they were all juggling a million things, they asked if I wanted to step into that role as a mod, as an admin. I said, sure, why not? Especially since, as I said before, I'm immunocompromised, so I really needed to sit down and serve in the ways that were probably best for me, which, moderating a Facebook group is perfect for someone who's not trying to leave the house every day, and I figured that was a way that I can propel movement. Obviously, I want to also add, Facebook is not like, a Facebook group is not a social movement, right? That really, there's a ton of labor that's happening behind the scenes that's actually, connecting people with resources and creating these whole networks. That this is just like a small piece of the work. But if I can step in and help on that small piece of the work, then I'm happy to do that.
That's great. Well, and that's like the key right now, right? For all of us is like whatever we can do wherever we are, whether it is sitting down or, on Facebook or somewhere else, like doing what we can. And I think that's where too, that question of like, how do you attack something so big? It is all those little steps and pieces and all the things that everybody's
100%.
doing.
And that existed prior to the pandemic, and I think that's like the thing to really uplift, because of course, anytime there's a crisis, anytime there's something that's really, I think, in the zeitgeist, let's say, a social issue, I think often we look to the big glamorous, like wanting to be on the front lines, but it's not always, but I mean, change has always happened in these like little moments. And it's really about, again, the intentionality, but also that it's sustainable effort, that you're not burning yourself out, that you're doing these little things, but you're doing them consistently, and that it makes a difference over time. That is, in fact, how I think some of the larger movements are built. And so I think there is no shame in just saying like, hey, I don't have the capacity, especially right now when I know a lot of folks are hurting financially, A lot of folks have immunocompromised people in their family. Maybe they can't do as much as they would like to, but just checking in on that one elderly neighbor, just doing one or two extra things. If all of us are doing that collectively, it eases the burden, I think, of this very difficult time for everyone.
Yeah. So are you glad that you left DC and came home?
100%, because I could not have purple hair if I was in DC. I think I'm like a late in life bloomer because I had to be so like corporate. So I'm living out all my teenage rebellion in my 30s now that I have the freedom. But also, I mean, being home has been, I think, very reinvigorating. But also, I've leaned more into my authentic self. It was DC. I was always a square peg in a round hole kind of world. And no matter how much I was trying to conform to fit, I think the mold of what success was there was just always something off, like something that wasn't clicking and connecting. And I was just kind of, even though I was, quote, successful, I was always hitting wall after wall after wall after wall. And I finally realized or listened to, I think, that deeper voice that had been there for quite some time that was just like, this isn't right. This isn't the right fit. Coming home, I know for many people it's like, oh, moving home, man, like, but it was actually, and I had a lot of people that were like, that's a mistake. What are you doing? Just like, I think you're going through a rough patch. You don't need to just blow up your whole life and move home. But I listened to myself, and this was exactly what I needed. Being closer to family has been amazing because, as I said, I get to organize with my family, which is, a really rare and beautiful thing. Obviously, it can be frustrating, but it's also amazing. And I think at the same time, just being in the desert, like Tucson's an amazing community and there's a lot of opportunities to plug in, but there's also it's a really complex place. And I'm from here, and somehow it's just like, it fit like a glove, coming back. And it was one of the best decisions I ever made for myself. So I'm always, I think, someone who really advocates for, make that transition. If you know it in your gut, don't wait. Like, I waited way too long. I stayed in DC way too long. I'm a much happier person today because I left that job.
Yeah, I hear that. I mean, I do think there's something to be said for everything you did, even in those years where it felt way too long, have prepared you to be who you are and do the amazing work you're doing right now and every day. So Tucson is so lucky to have you, and I'm really grateful that you spent some time with me today to talk about what you're doing and to give some really good advice that I think can help a lot of people. I have one more question for you before we go, but do you have any last words, anything left unsaid?
I feel like I emphasize a lot of things. Mainly, again, follow your heart, be true. And I think that it's not complicated, right? I think we try and make it really complicated. How do you help? Like, it starts simple, start small, and then build up from there. And I think listening is so key. Don't go in thinking that you have the answers. Listen to what people need, and then you meet that.
That's great. Thank you so much. Last question. So obviously we're calling this Super Shiro series. Any super Shiros you want to shout out today while we're here?
Oh, so many superheroes. Definitely my mother, Tiera Rainey. Not only do I look just like her, but she literally is the biggest mentor of my life. Angela Davis, because her life has deeply inspired mine. Miriam Kaba, who is an abolitionist and thought leader that tweets the most inspirational, critical analysis, and every day it pushes me to be a better person. And really just every single femme that is getting up and taking care of families and elderly and stepping up in this moment. I see all of you, and I deeply appreciate all of you. You inspire me.
Thanks. Thank you so much for watching. This has been Super Shiro, brought to you by the Women's Foundation of Southern Arizona. Tiera Rainey, community advocate in Tucson, joined us today. Please share your own hashtag Super Shiro stories, tips, resources all over social media. Thank you so much. And I know times are tight and everyone is in need. And if you are inclined and able, we would love a gift at womengiving.org or to any community organization or person in need right now. Every dollar matters. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thanks for having me.